Okay, what were we going over last week? John 18, at the end of 18. And what had just taken place? What was his name? What's that? Sure it is. Malchus, yeah. So we went over the arrest of Jesus, and we went over his trial in front of who? What's that? The Sanhedrin. He went his trial before Annas, right? And one of the things that we want to realize is that John really puts the emphasis on the former high priest rather than the present high priest. John in his gospel puts the emphasis on Annas, not on Caiaphas. And that has some significance for John rather than the other writers of the Gospels. And that would be because we touched on this last time, because John's emphasis would be away from the high priest that's been deposed, or he would be away from the high priest that is present and has been set up by Pilate, and is emphasizing the previous high priest. And we remember that the high priests were set up by Rome. Rome selected the high priests. And so Jesus is brought before the high priest, Annas, and is questioned. And we also talked about Peter's denial of Christ. And the fact that Peter is obviously very stressed, he's tired, and he's brought into a situation where he's isolated, right? John lets him in to the courtyard, and Peter comes into the courtyard, but it seems that John abandons Peter, and Peter is left alone amongst hostiles, and he's tired, and he feels vulnerable, and he's alone, and he's out of place. This is not a place that he's familiar with, and so he is really, really vulnerable at that point, and so he falls. This is the Peter that is full of bravado, but in this situation, after the wind has been let out of his sails because of Jesus' rebuke in the garden, because he cuts off Malchus's ear, Jesus tells him to put his sword away. Then everybody flees. And so Peter, who is ready to go up against a cohort of Roman soldiers and the chief priests and the guards from the temple, is told, cut it out. No pun intended. And so then he flees with the rest of them. Then he is allowed into the courtyard. And so he is really feeling off his game and really vulnerable, and he falls. And so after this, we're going to look at John chapter 18, 28 to 40, and we might get further. Somebody asked me to do a question and answer, but he's not here, so we won't do that. And I'll blame Chris. Because he says, maybe we should do a question and answer for the last one. And I said, no. So, here we go. John chapter 18, 28 to 40. Then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters, so that they would not be defiled but could eat the Passover. So Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusations do you bring against this man?" They answered, "If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourself and judge him by your own law." The Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken, to show by what kind of death he was going to die. So Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, Are you the King of the Jews? Jesus answered, do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me? Pilate answered, am I a Jew? Your own nation and chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done? Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not of this world. Then Pilate said to him, so you are a king? Jesus answered, you say that I'm a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world to bear witness of the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. Pilate said to him, what is truth? After he had said this, he went back outside to the Jews and told them, I find no guilt in him. But you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. So do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews? They cried out, not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber. So, we start out, and the first thing we need to do is to have some background about who Pilate is and what is his job. He's the governor of Judea, right? And what is his job as the governor of Judea? What is the official capacity and authority of the governor of Judea? What had the Romans empowered the governor of Judea with? Governing, you could say. But elaborate. What do they do? Do you know? What's that? They suffer. Yeah, it was not a great appointment. Not much fun there. But basically, he is responsible for a few things. Pilate is responsible for, one, the military oversight of this region. And in having that oversight, he is also responsible for the judicial processes that relate specifically to Rome in the region. The way that the Romans worked was that they pretty much left local affairs to the locals, right? They were only really concerned with what affairs related to Rome specifically. That's what the governor dealt with. He didn't really deal with local affairs. Rome would go into an area, take it over, and then just basically leave things run the way they run, with all the magistrates and authorities in place, and only when it really dealt with Roman law or Roman problems did the Romans intervene or have jurisdiction. So basically, in Judea, it was the Sanhedrin and local authorities that would govern basically the day-to-day affairs of the province, and only if it dealt with Roman problems, then Pilate would step in. The other thing that he was obviously responsible for was gathering taxes. So he was responsible for all these tax collectors that we are familiar with from the Gospels. That's what Pilate would have overseen, that collection of taxes. And one of the other things that is really pertinent to this is that Pilate was also responsible for setting up the high priest and governing the high priest. So he was responsible for selection of the high priest. And as it turns out, that Caiaphas was appointed by Pilate, and his term actually lasted. Pilate, unlike other Roman rulers, had kept Caiaphas in place, and he would keep Caiaphas in place, according to many sources, until Pilate is actually removed, and then Caiaphas is removed. Right? So that's the scenario we have. Even the vestments, even the articles of clothing that the high priest wore were kept by the Romans in the fortress, right? In Pilate's jurisdiction, right? So he had control over the vestments. So this is what we're dealing with. We have Pilate, who is the Roman authority, and this whole thing about not allowed to do capital punishment by the Jews seems to be a recent development. It wasn't the usual case, but it was perhaps something that had just been instituted really close to that time. So it would have been in the forefront of the mind of the people involved, right? And so that's the kind of situation that we have here. That's the Roman governor's jurisdiction, and that's going to come into play in what John relates here. So they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters, and it was early morning, and they themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. Now, when we look at that, we think, okay, they didn't want to be defiled, and they wanted to eat the Passover. And that is absolutely true, that they did not want to be defiled. And by going into the governor's residence, or where his place was, they would be defiled. But there's something else here that happens that's important, and that is it sets the tone for what's going to take place, which is that Pilate has to come out to them. So the Jews are already forcing Pilate to make concessions already based on their religion and based on what they value. And so he has to come out to them. They don't go into him. And so Pilate is already, he is known for having a tension with the Jews. He's already, we know from the Gospels, that he's already slaughtered some of them in the temple and mixed their blood with their sacrifices, right? So Pilate has this tension with the Jews already. And here we have the Jews coming with Jesus. Now, we also remember that Pilate is responsible for handing over a Roman cohort to go and arrest Jesus. So the idea that some people have given that Pilate was kind of shocked or surprised that they show up with Jesus is not at all true. Pilate knows what's going on. He's the governor in Judea at the time of the Passover, and he is in the know. That's his job, to know what's going on. And there's been all sorts of kerfuffle that's going on. The triumphal entry, right? There's tension between Jesus and the leaders. Jesus has cleansed the temple, right? So it's not like he's ignorant of all that's going on. He was the one that gave permission for the cohort to go and arrest Jesus. So he knows what's going on. He is not taken by surprise. And so when they show up, he knows why they're there. He knows what's going on. And so they show up and they won't come in. And Pilate has to go out to them. And Pilate goes outside and says, "What accusations do you bring against this man?" And they answer him, "If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." The Jews said to him, "It's not lawful for us to put anyone to death." This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show what kind of death he was going to die. Okay, so we get the stage set here that the Jews have brought Jesus, and from the Jews' point of view, Jesus is a troublemaker, and he is a threat to their power structure. Pilate knows this, and Jesus is this pawn in this struggle between Rome and the Jews. And so Jesus is brought there, and the Jews already display a defiant attitude. Do they bring a charge against Jesus when Pilate demands a charge? No. It says, so Pilate went outside to them and said, "What accusations do you bring against this man?" And they answered, "If he wasn't doing evil, we would not have brought him to you." And Pilate said, "Take him yourself." They don't bring a charge against Christ. And if you read the other Gospels, it's only in one of them that they actually mention a charge, but it's unclear the timeline. whether they have already brought the charge or whether they're bringing the charge or whether it's in the future that they bring the charge. So according to John's gospel, they never bring the charge that he claims to be the king of the Jews. Right now, had they brought the charge previous when they went for the Roman cohort? It's a possibility, but we don't know that. I assume that they did, but there's no charge brought here. And they said, if he wasn't doing evil, we wouldn't have delivered him to you. Very insolent. The tone is insolent. The tone is confrontational, that the Jews they have authority. Rome has given them authority. And so there is this already a tension between Pilate and the Jews. And so there's this tension of authority, and the Jews are going, if he wasn't doing evil, we wouldn't have brought him. And then Pilate comes right back and says, well then, if it's a you problem, it's a you problem. Go and deal with it yourselves. I don't want to have anything to do with it. Basically, I've already done my part. You guys take care of it. This has nothing to do with me. And they said, we can't put him to death. Now, what do we know about the Jews and putting people to death? Do they put people to death? Yeah, they put Stephen to death, right? They don't have any problem with putting people to death. So, realistically, what's going on here is that the Jews are making a point. This is a point that's being made. They are making this an official act. We talked about this before, that the Jews want this to be official. They want the execution of Christ to be official, and it has to do with their relationship to Rome, because what was the prophecy given by Caiaphas? Right, it's better for one man to die than the whole nation perish. If Jesus keeps causing trouble, the Romans are going to come against us, and they're going to take away our nation and our temple, right? So this is all about this relationship between Rome and the Jews. And so what you see here is that the Jews are trying to use Jesus to get Pilate to do their dirty work. They want Pilate to do the dirty work so that they can manipulate and put Pilate under a type of control. They're going to make him do what they want him to do. And so that's where the Jews are coming at. And Pilate is going to fight against that. And Pilate is going to seek to adhere to Roman law in this matter. And so you see this tension between the two of them. Pilate doesn't have any problem putting innocent people to death. Let me put that to you. He has already killed lots of people and will kill lots of people. So it's not a matter of Jesus is an innocent man and I don't really want to be involved in his death. That's not really Pilate's thing. He doesn't mind putting innocent people to death, according to history. So there's more that's going on. The other thing that's interesting in this section is that this was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show what kind of death he was going to die. So what you have is you have the Jews trying to manipulate Pilate, and you have Pilate is resisting the Jews. You have this tension between the two. It's a power struggle between Pilate and the Jews using Jesus, but Jesus is the one who's in ultimate control. That this is all playing out according to the plan of Almighty God. That Jesus is not a weak and helpless victim of circumstances here. He is in absolute control. So even though they are trying to play out their little power politics, it is Jesus who is in control of the situation, and they are acting only in accordance with the sovereign, predetermined plan of Almighty God. Okay. So, Verse 33. So Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and chief priests delivered you over to me. What have you done?" Okay, so we see here that even though in accord with the recording of John, Pilate has not received an official charge by the Jews against Jesus, he brings up the charge himself, doesn't he? So we talked about this last time. We talked about that there are two separate trials that go on with Christ. There is the religious trial and the civil trial. This is the civil trial. So the religious trial was, what is the trial for which the Jews want him put to death? Right, the charge of blasphemy, that you, a man, claim to be God's son, making yourself equal with God. That is the religious trial that Jesus is on trial for with the Jews. What is the civil trial? What is the claim that's going to be brought before Pilate? Insurrection, right? You yourself make yourself out to be a king, therefore you're an enemy of Caesar, you're an insurrectionist, and you need to be put to death for treason. Right? That is the charge. And so Pilate, who is well aware of what the charge is, he enters the headquarters and calls Jesus to him and says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus says, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" So here's the tone of Jesus that sets him apart from the helpless victim. Okay, so generally when somebody is arrested, they fall into a few categories, especially if they've been beaten and thrashed and they're brought before the governing authorities. If they're an insurrectionist, what is usually their attitude? What is usually their disposition? Defiance. Right. So I am going to overthrow your government. I am angry. I am not going to put up with this. You wait. You're going to get yours. That kind of attitude. Right? What is another attitude that if you're arrested and you're not an insurrectionist, you're not rebellious in heart, and you're scared to death for your life, what are you usually going to do then? What's that? Denial, and you're probably going to bargain, right? You're going to bargain for your life. Whatever you want, I'll give it to you. Just let me go. I don't want to die, right? That is the other typical thing that happens when people are arrested and they want to be let free. And the other one is silence. They're dejected. They keep their head down and their mouth shut. Right? That they just come into the situation and they want to stay out of trouble, and so they don't say anything. And those are the typical things that you see when somebody is arrested. If you like reading the Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn, when you see the people that come in and they come before the Soviets, those are the kind of, some of them are very defiant. Some of them try to bargain for their life for all that they're worth. They'll give anything. And some of them don't say anything. They just take it. They just want to keep a low profile and get through it. Right? Does Jesus fit into one of these three categories? You would want to say perhaps the last one, that he kept his mouth shut, he went as a sheep to the slaughter and was dumb, right? But that is true from the perspective that he doesn't plead for his life and he doesn't make threats, right? He doesn't curse. He does endure. But he is not mute. He doesn't just not answer any questions, that he doesn't not make any statements, as we see here. So, Jesus is, in spite of his sleep deprivation, in spite of the beatings, he is completely self-possessed, right? He is completely in control of himself and the situation, and he says, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say this about you?" Now, in light of what we've just said about the interaction between Rome and the Jews, what is Jesus saying here? Jesus is saying, okay, Pilate, I'm not a Roman citizen. Is this a local matter, or is this a Roman matter? Are you making a charge against me as an insurrectionist, as a rebel? Are you making that charge against me? Or are you just going on what they said about me, and this is actually just a local matter? This is about the Jews and me. Which one? Because if it's not a Roman matter, if you're not bringing a charge against me on the basis of Roman law, then you don't have any authority here. But if it's a Jewish matter, then you've overstepped your bounds, right? And this is important because what's going on here is, who is condemning Christ? Who has the authority to condemn Christ? We know that the Jewish leaders do not have the authority to condemn Christ. And guess what? Neither does Pilate. Neither group has the authority to condemn him. He is above both. And so Pilate answers, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done?" So basically, what's Pilate saying? Right? Realistically, this is about you guys, not about me. Right? I'm not in authority here in this matter because it's a local affair. What have you done? Are there any charges that you are guilty of that have to do with Rome? What have you done? He just said, "Are you a king?" And Jesus has said, "Do you say this on your own accord, or somebody else tell you?" Right? And he says, "I'm not a Jew. Your own nation and chief priest brought you here. What'd you do?" Right? So what is the charge? What is going on here? Yes, sir.
I just was thinking, I would argue that Annas or Caiaphas, I'm not sure, would have had the authority. They're the only ones that would have by the law. Like, if any cases too difficult to be decided between one kind of homicide or another, there's a list of things. Go to the place the Lord chooses, so you shall come to the Levitical priest or the judge who is in office in those days, and you shall inquire of them, and they will declare to you the verdict in the case. But they abdicated that. They didn't come out and say any verdict. They should have been inquiring from God because the people, brought.
Right. As far as and you're absolutely right. As far as a charge of blasphemy based on evidence goes, the Jewish authorities were the authorities technically over Christ. But upon investigation, which they'd already done the full investigation, the indication is that Jesus was innocent of the charge and therefore shouldn't have been charged in the first place, right? So basically, if he is the Messiah and if he is God, then they have no authority over him whatsoever, and they cannot judge him. And we talked about this before when we talked about the Old Testament psalm that talked about God being in the assembly of the gods. Right? Do you remember that one? So it says, God takes his place in the assembly of the gods, in the midst of the gods. Right? And Jesus says that it is what is meant by the gods there are those to whom the Scriptures came. Right? And he is at that very moment in the midst of the Jewish authorities and leaders. And so he is basically saying there that you are judging me, but I am the true judge. And all judgment has been handed over to me. And so that is the relationship of authority between the Jewish leaders and Christ. And Pilate's relationship is that he is the Roman authority and has no jurisdiction over this at all. So Jesus answers and says, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world... Wow, time went fast this morning. I was hoping to put Jesus on the cross this morning, but I don't think we're going to get there. Okay, so Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews, but my kingdom is not of this world. So what Jesus responds to Pilate in this is saying, this is not a local matter, and it is not a Roman matter. This is a spiritual matter. That is basically what he's saying. He's saying, my kingdom is not of this world, and if it had been of this world, if I had been seeking to establish my kingdom by force, then my followers would have fought against the Jews, not against the Romans, but against the Jews to prevent them from arresting me. But they didn't, because that's not the case. This is not a Roman issue. This is not a Jewish issue. This is a personal issue. And so Pilate said to him, so you are a king? And Jesus says, you say that I am a king, and for this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone that is of the truth listens to my voice. So Pilate latches on to so you are saying you're a king. And Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. Again, not a Jewish issue, not a Roman issue, but a personal issue. Everyone who listens to the truth hears my voice. This is about you, Pilate. Do you hear my voice? Do you listen to the truth? That's what Jesus is saying. And this is the beautiful confession. Where do we hear that term, the beautiful confession or the good confession? In Timothy, right? So in Timothy it says that Jesus, when he was before Pilate, gave the good confession. This is it. That Jesus is the King of kings and Lord of lords. He is the judge. He is the ruler over all. And his rulership is eternal. It is spiritual. His kingdom is eternal. His kingdom is spiritual. And it is above any earthly kingdom. That Pilate doesn't have any authority. The Jews don't have any authority. Christ is the only one with true authority because he is the only true king here. And the confrontation is to Pilate personally. And I would emphasize that when we look at this, you have to look at this, that Pilate is confronting this man, and this man is not conforming to the stereotypical response. This man is questioning him. This man is making definitive statements. He is not intimidated. He is not subservient, but he is not angry or rebellious or confrontational. He is bringing these statements in a rational way to Pilate for Pilate to respond. And so Pilate, as we'll see later on, as we'll see next year when we go on, Pilate is going to respond to that. It is going to have an impact in his life, that he is going to start to operate in a different way because of the interaction, the experience of meeting Jesus Christ. Just like the officers that went to arrest Christ came back and said, no one has ever spoken like this guy. Pilate is going to have that experience. And he is going to try really hard to let Jesus go. But in the end, his own self-interest is going to win over his own conviction. Okay. We'll end that for the year. Thank you for your patience for the year.